Lesson number 1. The World Prediscovery. The Old World, Europe and Africa. When we look at the world prior to the Columbian discoveries, we split the world into two parts. The Old World, which made up of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the New World, North America, South America, and Oceania. For the purposes of this lecture today, we will be looking at Europe and Africa. The next lecture will deal with North and South America. Now, Europe. When you look at Europe pre-discovery, it is probably the most influential portion of the Old World when it comes to the future development of the modern-day United States of America, especially the Kingdom of England, which will eventually become the United Kingdom of Great Britain. When we look at Europe, we first have to look at the evolution of Europe and how Europe evolved into a situation that would allow for the United States to be founded in the 1600s. We'll look at the evolution of Europe through the ancient antiquity, 3000 BC to 500 AD. We'll also look at the Middle Ages, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages or the medieval period, from 500 to 1500 AD. The first of the ancient civilizations that make up Europe is ancient Egypt. Now, some might be looking at me and saying, wait a minute, I know for a fact that Egypt is in Africa. Well, physically it is, but prior to the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, Egypt was considered politically to be part of Europe. And that is because it had more in common with states like ancient Greece and ancient Rome than it did with any of the other African states that existed at the time. Ancient Egypt will exist as an independent power from about 3000 BC to 332 BC, and it will be the world's first superpower. It'll have the first modern-style government, and it will be an absolute monarchy. There will be no democracy here, but it does have a limited bureaucracy. And this is very important because it means that the monarch is not handling every single thing himself. The monarch has a grand vizier that rules portions of the kingdom on his behalf. He also has ministers of state that handle things that he does not feel like being involved with. So when you look at the evolution of government, ancient Egypt is the first modern-style government in the history of the world that we have found so far. The second of the ancient civilizations that helped create Europe as we know it today was ancient Greece. Now, ancient Greece was not a unified country like we think of today, the Greek state. It was actually a series of city-states that were located around the Aegean Sea, and each city controlled the land around that city. Many of the leaders of these city-states were traditional rulers, like chiefs and kings, but some were much more advanced. I would say very similar to what we see in Europe today and the United States. Of all the Greek states that flourished during this time, probably the most important is Athens. The reason I say this is because Athens is considered to be the cradle of Western civilization. Athens will rise to be the center of arts, learning, and philosophy. Some of the greatest minds of antiquity will live during the Athenian period, people like Socrates, Plato, Pericles, Aristotle, Xenophon. All of these people here on the right that you see on the slide were very important philosophers that even today, when you take a philosophy class, you learn, you read their writings and learn about their philosophical ideas. And one of the philosophical ideas that came out of Athens is what we now refer to as the idea of democracy. Now, the democracy that they used in Athens was what we call a direct democracy. This is a form of government based on the principle of people collectively making decisions. This means one man, one vote on everything. There are no representatives that will go and sit in a Senate or sit in a House of Representatives to make decisions on your behalf. You actually voted on every little thing that the government was going to do. Now, let me be clear, this is not a liberal democracy like we have in the United States. Men were the only ones actively involved in the affairs of state. Men were the only ones who voted. Women, slaves, and foreigners had no voice in government, only men. And the men had to be citizens. And it did work fairly well. Reason why, of course, obviously, are that the Greek city-states were very small. They had very small populations. So it was easy for them to take a short period of time off to vote on whatever law or procedure that they wanted to pass and then go back to their daily lives. This is not a feasible type of democracy in a large population-based state like you would see in Europe today or in the United States. But this is really the truest form of democracy. That's why a lot of times when you hear people say the United States of America is not a democracy, that is technically true. Because the only real true democracy is a direct democracy, which is obviously not the form that we use or any modern state uses today. Now, democracy in ancient Greece thrives for about 1,000 years. But it does end around 338 BC, when ancient Greece is conquered by Philip II of Macedon. Macedon had been a large Greek city-state to the north that was ruled by an autocratic family. Philip II does die shortly after he conquers Greece, and he is succeeded by his son. His son's name is Alexander. Alexander would end up creating, at that time, the largest land empire in the world, the Empire of Macedonia. And this Empire of Macedonia also includes what was, at that time, Greece. Today, of course, we refer to Alexander II as Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great will rule over Macedon and the Macedonian Empire from approximately 336 to 323 BC. The third of the ancient civilizations that help make up modern Europe is ancient Rome. Ancient Rome will exist as a political body from approximately 753 BC to 453 AD. And by 200 BC, Europe was primarily united under Rome, as you can see from this map on the slide. During the Roman era, Europe will become the most technologically advanced, most educated society on Earth. Ancient Rome was considered to be the high point in Europe during the ancient antiquity period. Now, from 753 to 509 BC, Rome was a kingdom, the Roman kingdom, or the Kingdom of Rome. Its chief executive was a monarch, a king. And the king ruled over what he called the imperium. And the imperium is what gave him the right to rule. It also meant that he was immune from any kind of prosecution. The chief executive, the king, was the commander-in-chief of the military. He appointed all the tribunes, which were essentially the Roman version at that time of a prime minister. He appointed the Praefectus Urbi, or what we call the warden of the city. This was essentially the city manager to run the city government. And he appointed all the members of the Senate, which was the upper chamber of the legislature. Also, a position of the monarch was that he was the chief priest. The term for chief priest in the Latin language was pontifex, meaning bridge builder. And this was essentially a bridge builder between the people and their gods. And the chief priest controlled the Roman calendar. He decided when all the holidays and festivals would happen. He also was nominally in charge of all the religious ceremonies. Now, of course, obviously, sometimes the monarch was the chief priest. Other times he would appoint a chief priest to handle those positions for him. But very much like the Queen of the United Kingdom today, who is the supreme governor of the Church of England, he was essentially the chief priest of the Roman state. The monarch was also technically the chief legislator. Legislatures had at this time very little power or independence from the monarchy. They could only be convened by the king, and the king could send them away at any time. The only real thing that the legislatures did was discuss legislation that had been proposed by the king himself. And all they really did was vote yes or no on legislation. Realistically, the king had a veto over their ratification. The only sole power of the legislature, of the Senate, was declaring war. The monarch was also the chief judge. He was the chief judicial officer during times of war and peace. There would be a council that was sometimes appointed by the Senate to advise him during trials, but they were only an advisory board. They had actually no power over his decisions. The king could also appoint lesser officials to serve as judges for minor cases, especially non-death penalty cases. He could appoint someone to act on his behalf. But if you look at the Roman kingdom, the monarch has a lot of power. And then you have this legislative body called the Senate. It had very little power. The Roman Senate at this time was the chief counsel and legislative coordinator for the king. Very little real legislative power was enacted within the Senate. The Senate was appointed by the king, meaning they could also be fired by the king. And the only real time that the Senate had any real authority was during an interregnum. After the king had died, before the next king could be chosen by election, and this is where there was a little bit of democracy. There was an election for king, but it always came out of the same family. But while there was no king, the Senate ran the kingdom until the next king was chosen. In 509 BC, the Roman people had had enough of the monarchy, and so they decided to overthrow the monarchy and replace it with the first representative democracy in world history. Sometimes we refer to this as a republic. Now, the Roman Republic, as it will be known, had an unwritten constitution. So it had an unwritten government guideline, but there was a guideline there. But the democracy was not liberal. In fact, those that were appointed or elected to these positions were, in fact, representative of the great and learned, aka the wealthy and highly educated. Now, this will be a representative democracy, as I said before. That means that it's a form of government based on the principle of electing people or individuals to represent you. Therefore, you do not vote on the legislation yourself. You vote on the people to represent you, and they vote on your behalf, which is essentially what we do here in the United States today. The United States is a republic, just like the Roman Republic. Now, if you look at the government organs of the Roman Republic, you will see a lot of similarities in the modern-day United States. First of all, the Senate. The Senate had oversight over money, the national government administration, and all foreign policy. The Senate had the authority to appoint what they called consuls, which in our terms was temporary dictators during times of crises. And they would pass decrees that were followed by what they called magistrates. Underneath the Senate were regional legislatures, the Assembly of the Centuries and the Assembly of the Tribes. These were your local leadership. These were the people that enacted new social civil laws. They carried out the capital punishment. They would declare war, and they would ratify the census when it was taken. Now, as far as the chief executive, there really wasn't a chief executive for the entire period of the Roman Republic. The Senate mainly ruled during this time. Now, there were what they called magistrates. Magistrates were separated into following ranks that we're going to talk about here in just a second: consul, praetor, censor, and dictator. But these people were temporary administrative or military leaders that would be used while the Senate was unable to fulfill their duties. Now, consuls were the supreme power in both civil and military affairs. They are essentially your administrative head of the republic. When they are in Rome, they are essentially the chief executive. And when they are in the field with the army, they are the commander-in-chief. These people would get a one-year term, and it was non-renewable. The second of these was called a praetor. This is the person that administered the law and commanded the regional armies. So each province of Rome would have a praetor that would rule over it. The third of the magistrates was called a censor. And these people were elected every 5 years to an 18-month term. And all they were doing is conducting the national census. So every 5 years you would elect a censor. They would then spend the next 18 months conducting the national census, and then they would leave office. And then another census would have to be done, and they'd elect another group of censors to do that. Of course, right now we are going through a census here in 2020. The last of these is called a dictator. Now, dictators were elected during emergencies, when the Senate would have to be suspended, times of war, usually. And what would happen is you would appoint a dictator. Then the Senate would go out of session for 6 months, and the dictator would run the country. When his term was over, he would resign, and the government would be restored. Now, this started in 509 BC, and you would think that many people would take advantage of this, and there would be lots of what we now consider to be dictators, people who would rule for life. But the system worked very well. Until 49 BC, there were very few dictators, and most of the time they came, they served, and they left. That is until 49 BC. In 49 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was elected dictator for life. The Roman Senate did this because of the fact that he was a military hero. What they didn't understand was that Julius Caesar, as we primarily refer to him today, had other visions for the Roman Republic. He hoped to create a more stable, in his view, hereditary chief executive that would help administer democracy. And in 49 BC, he began to make reforms within the Roman Republic, to the point that by 44 BC, just 5 years later, a group of senators believed that Julius Caesar was in the process of completely destroying the Roman Republic and replacing it with something else. And so a group of these senators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus, assassinate Caesar on March 15th, 44 BC. Now, in the Roman calendar, the middle of the month was called the Ides, and that's why sometimes you hear this referred to as the Ides of March, because the Ides of March is approximately the 15th of March. The Ides of March are the midpoint of March. Julius Caesar is now dead. The question is, what happens to the Roman Republic? What happens to the Roman Republic is there is a civil war between the pro-Senate side and the pro-Caesar side. Caesar's side was led by his nephew and heir, Octavian. And in 27 AD, Octavian is successful. He does win this civil war, and he is appointed by the Senate dictator for life. And he is very popular during his reign. He always saw himself, by the way, not as an emperor like we now refer to him as. He saw himself as really very much like we would now consider to be a president for life. That he was just a first among equals, so to speak. And some of the honors that he's given during his lifetime, and his official name is Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. But during his reign from 27 AD to 14 AD, 27 BC, to 14 AD, he would be given the title Imperator, which means Commander-in-Chief. Obviously, that is the Latin root word for the name Emperor, for the word Emperor. He is given the name Augustus, or Illustrious One. A lot of times you hear in royalty the term an Augustus Majesty. Augustus, of course, we also, obviously refer to him as Augustus Caesar, is the name that you hear him spoken of, mainly in biblical texts. He is also referred to as the Princeps, or the first citizen of Rome. He is referred to as the Pater Patrae, the father of his country. That sounds awfully familiar here for a certain American in the 1790s. He is also given the name Pontifex Maximus, or High Priest. Of course, we all know today that we still have a Pontifex Maximus in Rome. That character, though, is not the Emperor of Rome. That character is, of course, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Now, while Octavian, or Augustus Caesar, or whatever you want to refer to him as, rules from about 27 BC to 14 AD, he still tried to keep the inner workings of the Roman Republic intact. But within 100 years, the Republic is dead, and instead it will be replaced by a hereditary constitutional monarchy. Now, again, when you say the Republic is dead, that does not mean democratic norms are completely dead, because it is a hereditary constitutional monarchy. It is not an absolute monarchy like we'll see in the Middle Ages in Europe. Now, a country so large and powerful as the Roman Empire, why does it fall apart? Well, very quickly, there's two slides to kind of explain this. In 284 AD, an emperor by the name of Diocletian decides to split the empire into 4 sections. And instead of having one emperor, there will now be 4. There will be 2 Augusti, or senior emperors, and 2 Caesars, or junior emperors. Now, what he says is that for a period of time, the senior emperors will rule and the junior emperors will be their assistants. And then eventually, the senior emperors will retire and the junior emperors will take their place and then choose 2 new junior emperors. Diocletian is also known in history as the emperor that will heavily persecute the growing Christian minority in the Roman Empire. People think about Nero persecuting Christians. Diocletian took that to level 10. Now, even though Diocletian lives until 311 AD, in 305 AD, he will retire as the emperor. And he will go off into his palatial Aegean Sea palace and never be seen or heard from again. He is the first and only Roman emperor to resign or retire without being forced to, only because he wants to and live out the rest of his life in peace. In his place, one of the junior Caesars, or the junior emperors that becomes an Augusti, a senior emperor, is a guy by the name of Constantine. And he will rule Rome in the west. Well, around 308, 309 AD, the eastern and western emperors go to war against each other, both with the goal of winning and reuniting the Roman Empire into one Rome. And this is a back and forth battle between the Western and Eastern emperors. And the story goes, and this is the story, it's highly skeptical, but supposedly the night before the last major battle, Constantine is visited by an angel. And he is told to paint this symbol on the slide called the Chi Rho. The X with the P is called a Chi Rho. It's the symbol actually for Christ. Paint this on your shields, paint it on your banner, and carry it to victory. And supposedly that next day, Constantine does this. He wins the Civil War and reunites the Roman Empire. It's a nice story. We don't believe it to be historically accurate. More likely it was something that was come up with after the fact. We do know that Constantine did recognize Christianity after 312 as the official religion of Rome, but the reason that we believe he decided to make it the religion of Rome was not because the Christian God had given him a win in a major battle. It was more likely because he saw that Christianity was the new, fresh, hot religion. It was growing. Whereas the gods of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, no one was really interested in those gods anymore. People were heavily converting to Christianity. Christianity was it was the new hot thing, and people wanted to be a part of it. And Constantine decided that it would be a great idea to link his reign with this new religion. Part of the new religion was that Constantine also wanted to create a new city to be the capital of the Roman Empire. And in 330 AD, Constantine will found the city of Constantinople. He will do this on the ruins of the Greek village of Byzantium. This will now be the new capital of Rome. Sometimes later on, we'll refer to this empire as Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire. Unfortunately, the reunification by Constantine is just a little bit of glory too late. After Constantine dies, the Roman Empire begins a steady slide, especially in the West. So much so that within 150 years, the last of the Western emperors, and yes, the Roman Empire was split again a few years after Constantine died, the last of the Roman emperors is deposed by European barbarians, Germans. The last of these emperors is named Romulus Augustus, and he will surrender the Roman crown on 476 AD. The Roman Empire will die in the West. In the East, Rome will continue in Constantinople, but we now will refer to that as either the Eastern Roman Empire, which is how they referred to themselves, or as historians refer to them today, the Byzantine Empire. Now, what kind of society was created by the fall of the Roman Empire? Well, the society that comes up about 500 to 1500 AD we refer to as the Middle Ages. And this is a period of time where it was said that, quote, the torch of civilization was passed from the classical world of Greece and Rome to a society that was too weak to hold it up. And if you look at the Middle Ages, it was in many ways backwards in comparison to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But it was not devoid of its high points as well. The fall of the Roman Empire in 476 led to Europe being no longer the most unified place. It was no longer unified under one government, the Roman Empire. It was no longer the most technologically advanced, and it was no longer the most educated society on the planet. Now, why is this? Well, many of the elements of medieval society we're going to talk about in a few minutes are the reason why during the Middle Ages that Europe began to slide backwards. Things like the manor system or feudalism, agricultural patrilineal societies. Europe fell under a caste system during this time. There was a lack of education in Europe. Remember, under the Romans, there was compulsory schooling. Now, there will be very little in the way of schooling. Religious fanaticism. And politically, these states will, all of them, be absolute monarchies or absolutisms. Now, what is the manor system or feudalism? Well, the manor system or manoralism was a European economic system. Feudalism is a legal and military system, but they both do the same thing. They split society into two separate groups, the lords or the rich and the serfs, the poor. Now, the relationship between the lords and their serfs. Well, the lord is the landowner. He inherits his land, or what he calls a fief or fief, including non-landowners who reside on his property, the serfs. So the lord not only inherits the land, but he inherits the people that live on that land. The serfs had evolved from the agricultural slavery of the Roman Empire that we refer to as the servus. The lord protected them and allowed them to live on their land. The serfs would work that land and provided the lord with all the materials he needed to make money, to make war, to have banquets. Now, once a year, a serf could switch from one manor to the other. They were allowed to leave once a year and go somewhere else. And being a serf was not the greatest lifestyle. Serfs grow the food, they process the raw materials, they clean the manor houses, they cook the food, while the lords did really little of what we consider to be real work. Now, some people would say serfs are slaves. Not quite. Serfs are not owned by anybody. These are people who are tied to the land with no particular owner. Slaves are people who are tied to other people, making them property. So there is a distinction. I'm not saying that there's much of a distinction, but there's enough of a distinction that serfs are not what we consider to be slaves. Now, the American-style slavery that we think of today did not exist prior to 1450 in Europe, although Christian doctrine did allow for the enslavement of non-Christians. But by 1450, serfdom had died out. As a matter of fact, by 1450, it only exists in two places in Europe, Russia and France. By that time, most people were peasants, poor landowners, and renters. The Europe of the Middle Ages was an agricultural society. Small villages existed, surrounded by farmland. There were very few large cities. These were usually your political centers like London, Paris, Rome. In the agricultural society, the men planted and harvested the crops. They did so communally as a group. The main crops in medieval Europe were wheat, rye, and oats. They also herded the livestock, the sheep. Women were responsible for the child care, the preparing and preserving of food, the milking of cows, the caring for poultry, and making clothing. There was little in the way of hunting. By 1400, hunting was no longer economically important. It was primarily, by this time, a sport for the upper class. Europe was also a patrilineal society. Inside the family, the father was the supreme figure. His word was law. The father had absolute authority over his wife and children. And under European patrilineal society, the familial links went from father to son. That's why here in the United States, for the most part, men are born with their last name. Women give up their last name when they marry a man, because family links go from father to son. And the woman is actually joining a different family, and therefore that's why she changes her name to the man's name. Salic law also means that only men can inherit position, titles, and property. Women during this time could not get an inheritance. The mother, as I said, she assumed the husband's surname or last name at marriage. She surrendered all property to her husband. And for the most part, she submitted fully to the will of her husband. The only protection that she had is her dower, which meant that 1/3 of the family lands and goods belonged to her after her husband's death. The children, well, the sons worked for their father until they were in their late 20s, early 30s, until they were ready to go off and work their own land, if they were lucky enough to get it. The daughters were married off at an early age, usually by the early teens, 12 to 14. Daughters were married off by their fathers to ensure some kind of social stature or financial stability. Most of these girls were married off to men in their 40s and 50s. Question is, why would you marry your young daughter off to someone in their 40s and 50s? Well, by then you hoped that that man had made a living for himself, that he was financially secure. Maybe he was higher up on the social ladder than you were, which allowed for your daughter to improve her standing for her children and her children's children. Land was always inherited by the eldest son. We call this primogeniture. Daughters were given a dowry to entice potential suitors, while the younger sons were either forced to enlist in the military or enter the clergy. As I said, Europe was also a caste system. There was no promotion in social status in Europe. 95% of people were born lower class. 95% would die lower class. 5% were born into the nobility, were born rich. And those same 5% would die members of the nobility, even if they died without any money. This was truly a ladder without any rungs to climb. Now, some of the common European nobility titles, obviously the ruler of multiple areas was called an emperor or an empress. The ruler of one state was a king or a queen. Within that, a smaller principality would be a prince or a princess, a duke and a duchess, a marquis and a marquisate, an earl or a count and a countess, a viscount and a viscountess, a baron and a baroness, a baronet and a baronetess, and then the last three were knights, esquires, and then a gentleman or a lady. I want you to pay close note to that earl, count, and countess. In the European states on the mainland, primarily France and the German states, the male was a count and the female was a countess. But in the countries that make up the United Kingdom, Scotland and Ireland and England, the man was an earl and his wife was a countess. So a slight difference there. If you had one of those positions, you were essentially made for life. Education. Well, under the Greeks and the Romans, there was compulsory education. Much like here in the United States today, you were required to go to school for a certain amount of time. Well, during this period of time, knowledge that existed prior to 476 AD, during the Roman and Greek periods, was seen as pagan. So most people felt that it was unnecessary to continue such an unnecessary skill. So Europe at this time becomes largely illiterate. The only people who really know how to read or write in Europe are the Catholic clergy. The rich people found reading and writing to be largely unnecessary because they could hire someone to do it, and the poor had no time to learn and practice how to read and write. Some other things that were deemed too pagan, and therefore the Europeans erased them from their society, included medicine, hygiene and bathing, spices, running water. As a matter of fact, at the height of the medieval period or Middle Ages, men took a bath once a year on their birthday, and women took a bath approximately once a month, coinciding with their time of the month. Food in Europe was, let's just say, disgusting. If you want to know what European food was like during the medieval period, do not go to Medieval Times in Dallas and have their chicken. Instead, go to your local grocery store. Go to Albertsons, go to Food Lion or Randall's or Tom Thumb, and get yourself a piece of chicken. Take the chicken home, no salt, no pepper, no cheating. Put it in boiling water, boil it until it's cooked, and eat it. That was essentially what European food tasted like at the height of the Middle Ages. Running water. The Greeks and primarily the Romans had indoor plumbing. And yet this was seen as too pagan, and therefore Europeans did not want it, and they went to the old-fashioned style outhouses. Now, I don't know about any of you in here, but I could tell you for me, I don't care who came up with the idea of running water. I'm keeping that. You know, running water is one of the greatest inventions. And yet the Europeans said, no thank you, here in early 500, 550 AD. Now, religion was the only unifying force in Europe after the fall of Rome. It was the most powerful entity in Europe. Now, why was the church so powerful? Well, the Middle Ages were tough. This was not a good time to be alive. You watch these medieval movies of lords and ladies, but the reality of it is the Middle Ages were dirty, disgusting, and hard to live in. So the promise of paradise after death was just too good to pass up. Now, prior to 1000 AD, there was one universal Christian church, the Chalcedonian Christianity. This church had primarily existed since the death of Christ. It was the church that had been founded by the apostles. But around 1054, there began to be a competition between the appointed Bishop of Rome and the appointed Patriarch of Constantinople. Remember, Rome had been the capital of the Roman Empire. It was changed to Constantinople, and at that time, the Bishop of Rome lost his status, and the highest member of the Christian hierarchy was the Patriarch of Constantinople. And this led to a split in 1054 between the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church. The Catholic Church followed the teachings of the Bishop of Rome, who kept his position as Pope, and the Eastern Orthodox Church followed the Patriarch of Constantinople. And it was the Pope that was seen as the de facto ruler of Europe, even if he had very little power day to day. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople will rule over a church. If you look at the Eastern Orthodox Church, it is much more, historians will say, is much more like what the church would have been like under the apostles. The Catholic Church has changed and evolved over the centuries to be more European. The Eastern Orthodox Church, Orthodox, obviously meaning, the old ways, very Asian in its scope. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a minute, how could Christianity be Asian? Well, remember, where is the Middle East? Obviously, Israel, the Holy Land, is actually in Asia. The Middle East is Asia. So the Eastern Orthodox Church is closer, I'm not going to say exactly, but it's closer to what you would think of a church that maybe would have been of the time of Jesus of Nazareth versus the Catholic Church, which is more modern. Now, we won't talk about the Patriarch of Constantinople or the Eastern Orthodox Church again, unless maybe in passing. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what that church was and how it was primarily different than the Catholic Church and the Pope. Now, the reason why the church was also so powerful was because the Catholic clergy had huge influence over Europe. And this was because, first of all, the Catholic clergy was made up of younger sons of the nobility. So there were political connections. Many rulers, many members of the nobility had at least one or two younger children that were within the Catholic hierarchy. The other thing, too, is that clergy were the only literate people in society. And don't think that they wouldn't manipulate situations with quote-unquote God's words. They could say whatever they wanted because, let's face it, no one else could read the Bible. So they could push things the way they wanted them to. Another thing that made the Catholic clergy so influential in Europe was the fact that they got large amounts of land and money. The nobility left land and money to the church at the times of their death. This was their little last bribe to get into heaven. So, Catholic clergy by 1450, was very, very powerful in Europe. It was essentially the de facto kingdom of Europe, even if there were political kings running the show. Now, while the Catholic Church was the largest, most powerful in Western Europe in 1450, The Eastern Orthodox Church was extremely powerful in Eastern Europe, but you also had pockets of Judaism, mostly in Eastern Europe and Spain and Portugal, which we refer to as the Iberian Peninsula. But we also have Islam existing on the mainland of Europe here in 1450, mostly around the southern Iberian Peninsula. They had their own political entity called the Kingdom of Granada, which will exist until January of 1492. So you do have Muslims and Jews living in pockets within Europe, along with the majority Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. And remember, if you draw a line down the map of Europe about halfway, that is pretty much where the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox split occurs. Now, for the purpose of settling America, the Eastern Orthodox have very little to do with any of that. It's mostly Catholics and those who break away from the Catholics, the Protestants. Now, politics. Now, as you can probably figure out, democracy is not embraced by the Christian kingdoms of medieval Europe. And that is because democracy was seen as pagan. It was created and used by ancient Greece and Rome. These were not Christian peoples. And the Europeans will instead use biblical principles to create their new governments. Of course, when you look at the Bible, it doesn't talk about democracy and representative government. It talks about kings. In fact, they say that Christ is the Prince of Peace and the King of Kings. Biblical imagery is always very monarchical. And so when the Europeans decide to create their new countries, their new kingdoms, they will do so on this model, the biblical principle of kingship. And the type of government that they form is called an autocracy. Autocracy is Greek for self-rule, and it's a form of government where one person or group possesses limited power. They will do this through a philosophy called the divine right of kings. Their argument is that God chose the monarch prior to him even being born. He was chosen by God at the time his mother conceived him with his father, who at that time was the previous ruler's wife. Therefore, since God chose him to be king, the monarch is subject to no earthly authority. The monarch derived his right to rule from God. Therefore, the monarch doesn't have to, answer where his authority comes from. He's not subject to the will of the people or any of the estates of the realm, including the church. Since God made him king, only God can judge him. And as long as he's on earth, as ruler, he can do no wrong. Not only that, any attempt to depose him and replace him with someone else, or to restrict his power, would run contrary to the will of God, and in essence would be an act of sacrilegion. To question your king would be question your God. And that is why absolute monarchy flourishes from about 500 to 1500 AD. Now, there are some exceptions to this idea of male-only ruling. Women primarily were not allowed to play a political role unless they achieved their power by right of birth. And three of the most powerful women in the medieval period were queens. You had Queen Elizabeth I of England, who ruled England from 1558 to 1603. You had her sister, who ruled before her, Queen Mary of England, from 1553 to 1558. And you had Queen Isabella of Castile and Leon, who was queen from 1474 to 1504. But these three women were only rulers because they were the last option. There were no men within the family to take over. These three women were exceptional in that. And I'll say Queen Elizabeth I is by far the most exceptional of the three. And yes, I understand Elizabeth and Mary are a little outside of the medieval period, but we still kind of consider them to be medieval rulers. By 1450, though, the nobility began to challenge some of the royal authority. In France, the nobles created what they called the Parlement. Parlement is where we get the term parliament. That was the French legislature made up of the nobility. And in England, we have what's called the House of Lords. But these are still, at best, advisory boards. But by about 1600, both have accumulated quite a bit of power. So the era of absolute monarchy begins to start to wane in the later early 1500s as the nobility, the upper class, begin to start seizing some power from the monarchy. Now, as we wrap up looking at Europe, by about 1300, Europe was very much a shell of its former glory, as it had been under the Greeks and the Romans. Even as late as 1450, no one in Europe would have predicted that within 100 years, Europe would become the overlords of the world. But within 150 years, after an era of discovery and exploration, and the founding of America, Europe would be the rulers of the world. And you would see a revolutionary change for all of humanity. The second part of the Old World we need to address when looking at the founding of what we now refer to as the United States of America is Africa pre-discovery. Now, as you can see on the map, Africa is split into two distinct sections. The first, the top portion, is Arab North Africa. The second section, the much larger southern area, is referred to as Sub-Saharan Africa, Dark Africa, or Native Africa. Now, please note that the name Dark Africa does not refer to the color of the people's skin that lives in Sub-Saharan Africa. It refers to the fact that very little was known about the African continent by about 1500 AD, other than the small coastal regions that went from the Gibraltar to around Morocco area. Most of Africa was unexplored. There were tales of what existed in Africa, but most people in Europe had very little idea about what was in now Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa was considered to be part of Europe until about 600 AD, when it was conquered by the Muslim armies. Prior to that, it had been part of the Roman Empire. Arab Africa will replace Europe as the most educated, technologically advanced society in the world. Some of the cultural highlights. First of all, they used Arabic numeral script, which replaced the cumbersome Roman numerals for mathematics. They enjoyed the scientific method, where they used experimentation over observation for scientific goals. They created algebra, chemistry, and sociology. When it came to astronomy, They confirmed what the ancient Greeks had long held, that the Earth and the other planets revolved around the sun. In Europe at this time, they were still trying to make the argument that the sun and the other planets revolved around the Earth. Medicine, they created the first hospitals with educated doctors that were focused on treatment, not comfort. History was secular. It was not used for religious propaganda. Their colleges and universities were secular, focused on learning, not religion. All colleges and universities in Europe at this time were used to train the clergy. They were religious schools that were focused on the Bible. When it came to religion, North Africa had a unified religion. They all followed the Islamic Caliphate. They were Muslims. Therefore, North Africa was monotheistic and a male-dominated religion, Islam. When it came to politics, they were a hierarchical system, much like Europe, where a few families held power. Just like Europe, it was a male-only system for government and politics. But the difference is that the Arab North Africa was a theocracy. Theocracy means, in Greek, rule by God. It was a form of government where the religious authority is fully involved in the ruling of the nation. This is what we refer to as a union of church and state. And their argument for being the ruler even came very much like the divine right of kings. They believed that their right to be rulers came from God, except they called their belief the successors of Muhammad. They felt that very much so that the reason for them holding power wasn't necessarily because it was given to them by a deity. It was because they were related in some way to the Prophet Muhammad, who himself was made a nominal ruler by God, by Allah. Now, sub-Saharan Africa was much different compared to North Africa and Europe. In many ways, it's considered stagnant or backwards. And this is because it's not as modern as North Africa or Europe at the time. Now, I will say that in many ways, it was much more diverse and much more special than Europe and North Africa in that it was just a very diverse place. Europe and North Africa were very homogenistic, but sub-Saharan Africa was very different place to place. When you looked at politics, you had anything from monarchies to socialist-style councils that existed in sub-Saharan Africa. You had polytheistic religions that were based on ancestor worship, harvest and hunting, or other nature gods. Now, technologically, they were very similar to the Native Americans. They used stone weapons and tools. There was not a lot of metal work in sub-Saharan Africa. They also did believe in patrilineal societies based around the father and arranged marriages. But most of these societies were also small tribes that lived off the land. They moved frequently, but they were not all hunters and gatherers. There were some, like the Mali Empire and the Ghana Empire, many cities that were built in the south that became capitals of great land empires. So sub-Saharan Africa was very diverse compared to Europe and North Africa. But in many ways, yes, they were considered stagnant or backwards compared to the more modern North Africa and Europe.